Um, Ever since, I don't know about you, ever since the spring of 2019, it's been pretty exhausting. It seems like we have gone from emergency and trauma to pandemic to fires and floods and pandemic and then more floods. You know, I don't think there were plagues of locusts and frogs, but I'm pretty sure there were mice, wasn't there? We have lived through the past few years the most incredibly traumatic times. People have died before their time. Houses have been destroyed. Businesses have gone bankrupt. Towns have been washed away. Today we turn to the story of Martha, Mary, and Lazarus. Three good friends of Jesus, a miraculous teacher with a history of healing and even raising people from the dead. But this time, with a good friend being put into a tomb, Jesus delays for a few days. And as we saw in our video clip, that can't have been an easy time for Martha and Mary. And I think they asked many of the same questions that we ask in our traumatic and tragic times. Jesus, where are you? Why aren't you coming to help? Why aren't you coming through for me? I thought we were friends. You ever asked God those questions? Maybe not today. I certainly have in my life. Maybe for you, it's not when fires and floods hit because, well, we are being quite fortunate here in this neighbourhood in that respect. But how many of you lost a family member? Had a friend promoted to glory? Perhaps you've been through the trauma of relationship breakdown. You ever wondered what God was doing while you were suffering? This morning we look at this story and perhaps we'll find a sense of peace and understanding that we didn't have before. Because we will see Jesus in this story express tears, anger, truth, and grace. If you bear with me for the next couple of hours, we will explore each of those. I keep joking, one day I'll do it. When Mary reached the place where Jesus saw him, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you'd been here, my brother wouldn't have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews had come along with her and weeping, and he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled, and he said, "Where have you laid him?" "Come and see, Lord," they said. And Jesus wept. Jesus wept. How many of you in Sunday school, when told you need to memorize a Bible verse, said, "You know what I'll do? John 11:35, Jesus wept." Come on, hands. Anyone do that in Sunday school? Yes, come on, it's a standard. But you thought about that verse? It's weird. Doesn't make sense. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, why does Jesus weep? Why does he shed tears? He's about to raise Lazarus from the dead. Last week we saw it's not a new thing for him. He's done it before. He knows what he's going to do. He knows he can do it. He knows in a few minutes they're all going to be rejoicing. So why is he upset? Did that ever occur to you? Well, it's an interesting point because what it tells us is something about Jesus and something about Mary. It tells us something about God and it tells us something about humanity. Because the only consistent answer is that Jesus, being the very embodiment of God of love, is perfectly empathetic. This means that God feels what we feel. That God mourns with us. God rejoices with us. God sheds tears when we feel physical and emotional pain. God does not dismiss our pain. God does not disregard our emotions. God enters into them with us. God comes alongside us in our suffering as counselor and friend. We believe in a God who is with us. In sorrow and joy and everything in between, he sheds tears with us. But also, he gets angry. Now, I don't know, when Pam was reading this a few minutes ago, did you pick up the places in the text where Jesus gets angry? Did anyone? No, I know, right? It's weird. It's really, really weird, right? The really strange way. 2,000 years ago, this story happened, and people wrote it down in Greek and Aramaic. And a few centuries ago, they started translating those original texts with some help from the Latin into English, such as it was back in King James's era. And many times since that first English translation, people have published alternative English translations, more up-to-date English translations, more contemporary English translations, easier to read English translations, and you know what? They've all done this really weird thing to this story, and I don't get it, and I don't like it. It's irresponsible interpretation. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who'd come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Now, right there, where Jesus was deeply moved in spirit and troubled, the Greek word means to quake with rage. Isn't that interesting? Every English translation, probably based on Latin Vulgate's interpretation. Perhaps they think Jesus is a kindly, sweet and innocent little shepherd who never fought a lion or a bear. I don't know what they were thinking. But here it is, Jesus quakes with rage, visibly vibrating with anger. It's so weird that all the translators shy away from such barefaced emotion in Jesus. It's weird because when we're caught up in tragedy, when we're in trauma, when we're in grief, there are naturally times when we're going to get incredibly angry. Jesus was truly and properly man, quaking with rage, shedding tears of anger. It's a natural part of the grief process. And what we need to be very careful of is where that anger is directed. Have you noticed when people, humans like you and me, are faced with tragedy, trauma and grief, such as the pandemic and the fires and the floods and everything else, they always try and make sense of what has happened. And more often than not, they try to blame someone, or more likely themselves, to try and make sense of this incredibly difficult situation. You know what I'm saying? You know, people blame other people, yeah? Anyone know someone, if you're sitting next to them, put your hand up? No. It's all in this attempt of trying to make sense of the horrifically painful situation that we find ourselves in, the incredibly difficult circumstances we find ourselves in. Some people blame themselves. I shouldn't have bought a house in a flood zone. I should have paid more for fire insurance. I should have worn my mask more. Other people blame others. The council should have done more to build flood protection. The government should have done more, put more money into emergency services. The quarantine system should have been better managed. Big businesses should be held more responsible for global warming. But look where Jesus directs his anger. In verse 38, it says, Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. See, when Jesus actually gets to the tomb where Lazarus is laid out, he is again deeply moved. It's not the same word as before. This word means to roar or snort like an angry animal. An animalistic anger. But Jesus doesn't get angry with Mary, Martha, Lazarus, all the people around. And in the same way, God doesn't get angry with us. God doesn't get angry with the world and anyone. God doesn't blame humanity. God's anger in this story is directed at the tomb, at death, at the injustice of the universe. And this is a very, very important thing to remember. One of the regular podcasts I listen to, I don't know if you're into podcasts. Anyone into podcasts? I've got another one for you. It's called In the Minefield from the ABC. It's actually on radio as well, I believe. So if you know what time it's on, you can listen to that. But Scott Stevens and Waleed Ali get together for an hour and they chat about the moral and ethical issues of life. It's fantastic. And the topic this week was, is anger corrosive to the moral life? That's topical, isn't it? I don't know whether they knew I was preaching on this, but there you go. I was very grateful. Because Scott makes the point that Martin Luther King, in his teaching and in his way of seeing things, anger is completely and utterly wrong whenever directed at another person. He was absolutely categorically against anger directed at another person. So when Martin Luther King would talk about anger, he would talk about anger that has tears. Anger that is perhaps the description of exhaustion. Are we really doing this again? I can't believe these circumstances have happened again. See, it's not really directed at another person, but the brokenness of the world. A brokenness that sometimes causes soul blindness and contemptuousness. But it's a recognition of the brokenness of humanity and an anger directed towards that. To me, that's exactly the kind of anger we see Jesus express at the tomb. Tears at the brokenness, at the unfairness. Tears of anger at death and circumstances. So Jesus has tears to share for Mary. Anger directed at the tomb. But I want for a moment now just to go back to the initial conversation with Martha. Because he treats Martha very differently. He treats her with truth. I find it interesting that whenever we talk about the story of Martha and Mary, almost always people say the story of Mary and Martha. Is that what you've ever heard? Those of you who've been around church for a while, right? Mary and Martha, Mary and Martha, Mary and Martha. Mary never comes first. In all the stories, Martha is always the first on the scene. She is the action one. She is the one who is on the ball. She's the organised one. She's the truth one. And to me, that's a very powerful way in which Jesus deals with the both sisters differently. Lord, Martha says to Jesus, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died. Exactly the same thing that Mary says, right? So exactly the same situation, exactly the same things they've said to him, but Jesus reacts in very, very different ways. To Martha, he says, your brother will rise again. Perhaps he could have been a little bit more specific and said in 15 minutes, but he didn't. So I'm kind of glad he didn't. I'm glad he didn't, because as a result of the conversation that happens, he says something incredibly powerful. Whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this? See, he hits Martha with the truth. And there are two kinds of people in the world, right? Two kinds of people, when you go to comfort them in their distress, if there's one kind of person that doesn't want you to solve their problem, they just want you to be there with them in it. To comfort them and to be a presence with them. Yeah? Anyone know this? And if you're the kind of person that doesn't act that way, who doesn't act like that, you can go into a situation and say, right, I can solve your problem. No worries, he's going to raise from the dead. Or whatever Jesus does, right? If he'd done that with Mary, I don't think it would have gone down very well. And conversely, if with Martha he'd just cried with her and been with her in her pain, I don't think that would have gone down well either. It's amazing how Jesus is a masterful counselor and treats each as they would need him to be. Anyway, your brother will rise again. His response is, whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this? This is an incredibly complicated response. And, we could be here for a couple of hours unpacking these three sentences that Jesus makes. But we'll leave it. We'll just say this. If you believe, you will never die, even when you do die. Because if you believe, you will experience resurrection. That's what it means. Once again, English translations are not all that easy. But, see, in this case, they stick really close to the Greek, which makes it very confusing. But other times they don't. Anyway. Who would be a Bible translator? Every preacher on the planet criticises everything you do. All right. What is a resurrection? Because it is not the same as resuscitation. I don't know whether you thought much about resurrection. It doesn't mean, I hate to tell you this, because some of you may believe this. Resurrection does not mean that we're all going to live together in some golden city in the clouds. Jesus says, I have come not to make you out of the earth, to take you out of the earth to somewhere else, but to bring the power of heaven down to earth, to make a new heavens and a new earth, to make everything new. He says he will restore everything that was lost, to make everything right that is unfair. There will be health, there will be wholeness, there will be joy beyond anything we can possibly imagine. That's what resurrection means. A few years ago, I started having a recurring nightmare. It was after my wife and my kids were in a serious car accident. I was up in Wollongong, they were down here in Ringwood. And they had a serious car accident. And forever, since that day, I've been cautious of Melbourne drivers. Don't worry, now I am one. But, and I think this is a common nightmare. But it's a nightmare in which my wife had died, or was killed, or for some reason wasn't there. You know those kind of nightmares, right? Does anyone have this sort of recurring? Anyone have the nightmare where my wife has died? No? So I started having this nightmare. And I don't exactly know. I've never experienced it, what the loss of someone so close to me would mean. But I tell you what, the grief, the terror, the horror that I felt at those nightmares, if that's an insight, I don't want it. It was so real. It felt so real. And then I woke up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat, and I discovered something beautiful. I was in a cold sweat because my wife had stolen the doona. Hallelujah, my wife was alive. And for the next 5 minutes, I'm in this total joy because my wife is alive. I stole the doona back. I'd roll over to sleep. And it's that feeling that authors all over the centuries have tried to capture. Then that is the sensation of resurrection. Perhaps the best way I've heard it communicated is in the words of Samwise Gamgee in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. Has everyone read Lord of the Rings? Apparently they made it into a movie. Have you seen the movie? Have you seen the full movie? The 12 hours. It's the best way to see it. It's great. Anyway, if you've spent weeks reading the books or hours and hours and hours watching the movies, you get to the end. Samwise Gamgee has cast the ring has been cast into the fires of Mount Doom. Samwise falls asleep and he wakes up. And there's Gandalf. Gandalf, who they thought that died at the end of the first book. First book? Second book? First book. I can't remember where the book's starting in now. I've watched too many of the movies. Gandalf, they thought, was dead. The hero of the story. Well, Samwise is the hero. Or is it Frodo? Anyway, we can have a debate later. And he says to Gandalf, he says, I thought I was dead. I thought you were dead. Is everything sad going to come untrue? Isn't that interesting? And it's that sensation of waking up from a nightmare and discovering that everything sad has come untrue. It was just a dream. That's the sensation that they are trying to capture, that Tolkien was trying to capture in that pun. In the Brothers Karamazov, there's a great quote by one of the brothers, which doesn't really work in English, but Dostoevsky wrote this great, great piece. And authors throughout history have tried to understand this sensation. Everything sad is going to come untrue. It'll be like we wake up and this was just a dream and reality is back. That's what resurrection will be like. That's what I'm looking forward to. There'll be a time where there's a new heaven, a new earth, a new reality, and a completely new way of experiencing it. And we will discover everything sad has come untrue. I'm going to ask the band to come back because we're going to sing a song while we reflect for a moment. I don't know what you're facing this morning. I don't know if you feel grief. I don't know if you're struggling with health, wealth, and well-being. But we're going to spend some time in prayer and reflection. Perhaps we're going to adopt the position of Mary or Martha. We're going to seek Jesus' presence amid all the traffic of the waves. Perhaps this morning you need to know that God is with you, that God shares your sorrow, that God shares your pain. Perhaps you need to know that God is quaking in rage at the death and sorrow and injustice of the world. God is roaring with anger at the way in which the circumstances of the world bring pain and hurt. Perhaps you need to hear God say this morning, I am the resurrection. I have all power over life and death, and there will come a day when everything sad will come untrue. Let's reflect and pray. The band's going to play, and you'll be invited to sing along if you wish. Otherwise, you're welcome just to stop and reflect for a moment.